Greetings, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Conscious Cafe Global. My name is Gina Lazenby, and I'm hosting our session today, which is being recorded. We have a really interesting presentation called Sensitivity is Your Greatest Strength. Who would have thought? Sensitivity, not a weakness, but a powerful gift. And tonight, our speaker to talk to us about this is Kirsty Allan. She's a psychologist, author, consciousness researcher, certified coach therapist, a community leader working with Broughton Sanctuary. That's near me in Yorkshire, and they have something called the Wyrd Experience. She may allude to that in her talk, but Broughton is the seat of a lot of consciousness research, and that alongside her work for University of Northampton involves a lot of Kirsty's time. She's creating a movement of people who recognize sensitivity as a gift. So Kirsty, we're going to give you a warm Zoom welcome with our hands. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gina. And thank you, Judy, for hosting me here. I'm just going to jump over to sharing my PowerPoint. As something of an academic, I would be, I would be remiss without a slide deck for you. So let's just start that from the beginning. Continue to share. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see this okay. Yep, you see a jazzy picture.
So sorry. Yes, we can.
Awesome. Just always got to check. Okay. So yeah, so I'm really interested in the intersection of something called psi and sensitivity. And what I want to show you today is a bit of an argument for why sensitivity might just be like your greatest strength. And if this appeals to you, if this resonates with you, then I invite you to follow on the conversation with the different offerings after as well. So I'm also representing a club that I have called the If Crowd, which is just mentioned down here, which you can find out more about later on. Okay, so we seem to have jumped. There we go. Okay. So the proposition here is really to ask, what if magic is already deep in our nature? I ask a lot of if questions, hence the If Crowd. And what if this magic, if you like, is actually a process of rediscovery? There's something that's always been there. And maybe it presents as a kind of subtle system. And what if it really is just the case that some people, maybe the few, are just that bit more attuned to it? And what if we've kind of forgotten that, or we've been told it doesn't exist? What if? And I want you just to hold that question as we go through this. And as I like to use a lot of metaphors, I'm going to throw this one straight in here. What if also we're kind of just like stuck starfish? And the reason I say this is because I was really astounded when I learned something about starfish. And that's that they have their whole neuronal network, their whole nervous system on the outside of their body. Yeah. And so when a starfish is in the ocean, there's no boundary, there's no barrier. It's in direct contact, its brain, if you like, its feeling system is in direct contact with all life. Everything that has been, everything that currently is and is in flux, and therefore the probabilities of what is unfolding and what can become. And I think some people, sensitive people, are a bit like starfish. We don't have this thick boundary that most people maybe seem to have. And certainly in the history of our evolution, it's thought that as we kind of, as developing humans, we came out of some kind of aquatic source, and that our nervous system and our neuronal network that becomes the brain kind of turns maybe like inwards, and we became really encased in this body. And maybe we took a little bit of the sea with us, and we call that cerebrospinal fluid today. That kind of inner sea, if you like, that saltwater liquid that travels up and down our spine and floods our brain and, bathes it in this kind of like ancient oceanic system, perhaps. And maybe there's just something in this metaphor for all humans where we all kind of are just quite attracted to the sea. Real estate will show you that we will pay about a third more, for example, to have an ocean view. We find the sea mesmerizing. The sound of the ocean can be very soothing. We kind of have a caution around it, yet we want to be immersed in it. We're attracted to this source, if you like, something deeper. Not a surprise that in the history of psychology and consciousness research, the ocean, or the sea, is often used as a metaphor for, what is perhaps on the surface, perhaps what lies beneath, what connects us all at our greatest depths. But who am I to be saying all this strange stuff about starfish and cats? Well, this is me. So my name is Kirsty, and I'm what's known as a highly sensitive person. I have a lot of different kinds of sensitivities. And sensitive people, we don't have one generalization. We all have our own individual formulas for sensitivity, if you like. So all my life, I've been very sensitive emotionally. I've been very sensitive psychologically, mentally, really wanting to know the detail of things, really observant, really noticing things. Biologically, I have a very sensitive system, the doctors might have always said. That for me, that manifests in inflammatory skin, allergies, maybe sometimes, dietary problems. All of these have shifted and fluxed across my lifespan. But through my core, I identify as a sensitive person. I'm just very responsive, reactive to what's going on around me and also what's going on inside me as well. I'm a noticer. I'm also what we might call in my field of research an EHE, or an exceptional human experiencer. And what we mean by EHE are experiences that don't quite fit the usual canon of understanding. So we might call these psychic experiences, we might call them encounters, we might call them spiritual or transcendent experiences. We might have different names for them, but they're quite often dismissed or overlooked in psychology and in the wider scientific fields as well. And I think that these two things are potentially quite intimately connected. So it's maybe not a surprise that as well as having an arts career, I'm very interested in psychology, that's my academic background, as well as well-being, but also the niche field of parapsychology, which is where we study EHE. We study, or what we might know as psi phenomena or anomalous experience and so many other names. But actually the consensus is kind of that these sorts of experiences are maybe not actually unusual or paranormal. They're very normal and they're actually very common and very typical, but they've gone unseen because people don't tend to report them. And when they do, they're often dismissed. That's the culture that perhaps that we have been in for a long time. Since childhood, I've been very interested in mystery philosophy. So very interested in, those fascinating hieroglyphs, and you get your encyclopedia and it's got ancient Egypt in there and you just want to become completely absorbed in that world, or out into space, or looking at all these ancient philosophies. So my whole life I've been interested in esotericism and those kind of subtle ideas around how we might be interconnected, maybe deeper meanings, deeper wisdoms that lie all around us. I've also become a coach and practitioner for adults and children who identify themselves as highly sensitive. I'm a sort of guide to the perennially anxious, people who maybe their resting state of being is one of anxiety, is one of caution, is one of not being quite sure about things, of maybe having a very intense inner critic, for example. And so I have a community for that, which is called the If Crowd. It helps people kind of transform, if you like, the challenges into what might be the strengths, which I'm going to show you. I'm a mum, a wife, I'm a snake appreciator, and I'm thoroughly owned by cats. And this is the boss here on the right. This is Maud, who will pretty much, as a guarantee, invade this webinar. So I have dreamies at the ready. That was one of my pre-webinar tasks. Okay, so what am I on about? So what is psi? So psi is basically this symbol. It's a little trident symbol, which, is interesting because it makes me think of the sea again, always noticing the connections. It's the 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet, and it's used in parapsychology just to represent that thing we don't quite know. We don't quite know what it is. How is it that people have a dream and then it comes true? How is it that people can, when asked to guess at an unknown target 5 minutes in the future, why is it maybe just a little bit above chance expectation they're getting it right? What is this? And we call it psi. So it's a neutral term that allows us to talk about unusual experiences, paranormal experiences, psychic experiences with a certain neutrality, because it doesn't quite have so many, connotations or belief systems sort of imported with it. And speaking very generally, there are kind of three sort of key areas that parapsychology seeks to explore and investigate. One is really about the acquisition of information. So you might have heard of ESP, Maybe you've heard about the telepathy tapes, for example. Maybe maybe you've had a dream that's come true. Maybe you've just had a moment of knowing something that's going to happen before it happens. Perhaps it's been that moment where you've just reached out to pick up your phone before it even rang and you already knew who was on the other end. Or just having this sense of something not quite right with a loved one and turning out to be correct. Or perhaps you're thinking about someone you haven't thought about in 40 years, and then the next day you meet them on the bus. Something like that. Yeah, this kind of strange way of knowing, this unusual sense perception. And then in a way, we kind of think of psychokinesis as almost being the other way around, although it is much more complex than this. But this is how we might be influencing the world around us from a place of subtlety, this mind-matter interaction, how our thoughts can influence reality, how our expectations or beliefs, how thoughts can become things, I believe, as Bob Proctor, I think, said. The law of attraction, for example, manifesting, and also maybe direct influence on something in the material world around us. So that is another way. And the third way is theurgy, kind of a relation to gods or divinity. So it's like contact with others. So maybe having some kind of transcendental experience where people feel like they're channeling information, or that they're acting on a mission, or that they're having some kind of direct experience of a divine mind, or perhaps it's maybe an elemental spirit, or perhaps it's, any number of other kinds of entities that could be coming through in any shapes, in any form. And it looks like underlying these kinds of experiences, there may be these qualities, if you like, of having a certain kind of intention, paying attention, that's like noticing the subtle, and then a kind of expectation, which is almost like faith, if you like, that something is going to unfold, that there is a reality here, a subtlety that is worth paying attention to. Okay, and so what is high sensitivity? So again, I said this is science, sensitivity, how sensitivity might be your greatest strength. Well, what is high sensitivity? Well, according to Roxburgh, whose research loads in this area, and I really recommend her work, it's like feeling and experiencing everything in HD. This is a quote from one of Roxburgh's participants. And maybe many of you can relate to that. Things just seem more intense sometimes, or perhaps all the time. Bright lights, loud sounds, maybe it's empathy, the feelings of others, and so on. It's all very nuanced and very personal. In the 1990s, the term highly sensitive person was coined by Art and Elaine Aron, and it became kind of like the colloquial, common parlance for this way of being, the HSP, the highly sensitive person, could also be the highly sensitive child as well. There are other potential formulations as well. However, this is the one I'm focusing on today. And being highly sensitive is characterized by thinking and feeling deeply all the time. This isn't something you sort of train for. It's not really something you can switch on or off. It's just who you are. It's your sort of resting state of being, that you think things, you feel things, and you go deep all the time. In a more formal context, in terms of research, it's referred quite specifically to sensory processing sensitivity, well, SPS for short. And that's not to be confused with sensory processing disorders, although there may be some overlap. If we look at the big Venn diagrams of labels, that could be the case, but that's quite a big area of debate in itself. So sensory processing sensitivity is not necessarily something which is disordered. It's considered to be a healthy trait. It's considered to be a very natural and innate one as well, which we'll go on to look at. Sometimes researchers refer to environmental sensitivity, and that can be quite specific. That can be things like responding to different electromagnetic field strengths, maybe having an electrical sensitivity. It could be maybe having a sensitivity to sort of agents in your environment, like maybe chemicals, maybe a chemical sensitivity. It could be sensory based, bright lights, loud noises, overwhelming smells. It could be any number of things. And there's some fascinating work by a chap called Mike Jower, whose work I highly recommend. And he looked at sick building syndrome, which led him into this area of research, sort of showing that, yes, some people actually are affected deeply by subtle differences that other people just won't notice. Aaron likened this in a metaphoric sense to being an orchid. So if people are flowers, we might have the majority of people are tulips, They can just thrive and grow en masse in a field, bit of sunlight, bit of rain, job done. On one end of the spectrum or a continuum of sensitivity, we might have dandelions who will just like grow through the concrete. They're just gonna like burst that, concrete or asphalt open and up they go towards the sun. And then on the other side of the tulips, you have the orchids, where the conditions that are needed for the orchid to thrive are not more needy, but they are specific. And it's thought that sensitive people are like an orchid. Their needs are quite specific in order for them to thrive. But the beautiful thing is, when they do thrive, they can potentially thrive, maybe like no other, and be a certain kind of prized flower in the greenhouse, if you like. Not to, disparage good old dandelions, but there we go. That's the metaphor. And so Aaron also offers this really handy acronym as well to kind of identify with high sensitivity, that there's a depth of processing, maybe a tendency to overstimulation or perhaps overwhelm, maybe taking in too much, empathy, and a sensitivity to the subtle. So you can remember it as an HSP does. So we'll be taking a break shortly to see how many of you might feel you resonate with this. So I'll just pause a moment as I can see people might be maybe making some notes. I will be happy to share the slides as well if anyone would like them. So I'm just a touch point here because this is not my area of specialism in neurotyping. However, it comes up a lot. People do want to know what's the relationship between high sensitivity and, say, ADHD or autism. Well, we don't really know. But what we do know is that sensitivity is a continuum. Everybody's sensitive. Everybody is on that sensitivity continuum. Whether you're a dandelion, a tulip, an orchid, or anything in between, that's where it becomes, kind of complex and individual. But it manifests in many ways, and there may be various underlying factors which might help explain someone's sensitivity better. So if it's not sensory processing sensitivity, it might be, what's typically now known as neurodivergence, although these terms themselves are up for a lot of debate. But of course, a person can be more than one thing. They could also have red hair, people are people. And where terms become tricky, sometimes, the labels can be really helpful for people as an identity or as a framework. And at other times, maybe people find them a little limiting. Someone I know really well has said to me, she said, Kirsty, I love everything you say. I totally get it. But I just thought it's because I'm a Pisces. And it's like, that's as good an answer as any. Okay, so what's it like to be a highly sensitive person? What's the lived experience? So here's just some examples. And maybe see if you resonate with any of these. Maybe you walk in a room or you go into a supermarket and you're like, my eyes, who needs it this bright in here? Supermarket's the one that gets me, that overhead strip lighting. I swear I can hear it as well as like, feel it, and I'm slightly blinded by it. It could be that it's the TV, you go in a room and you're like, who needs the television this loud? And in fact, it could be a distraction because it's so loud. And it could be any kind of sensory stimuli in your environment. But you're also maybe sensitive to your own inner world experience. So maybe noticing pain, maybe noticing itches, maybe noticing temperature fluctuations, maybe noticing just changes within the self and commenting maybe more than maybe average. And perhaps that leads to feeling like, oh, I'm too sensitive. You get these messages, or people, maybe commenting that, that maybe you can't handle pain or you can't handle the sensations. The idea is actually that with sensitive people, they might just be experiencing more of it. They might just be aware of more of it. So they're genuinely responding to something that is felt. Sensitive people tend to be affected by emotions, especially, their own, obviously, but that extends to the emotions and moods of others. So that could be other individuals, but it can also be collective. So it could be the dynamic in a room, the sort of experience of being able to walk into, maybe a workroom in your place of work and just know somehow that there's been an argument, or maybe sensing a problem within a couple, etc. Just having this sense you can't quite put your finger on, but you're reading the emotion. And it may extend to animals as well. It may not just be with humans. It may also extend to a wider collective, like sensing troubles in your community, sensing a rumbling in society. and this extends again and again. If you think of that inner world all the way out and back in, because that outer world is then affecting how you feel, how safe you feel in your inner world, and so on. You might be the sort of person who just needs to adjust things. You just want to adjust stuff in a room. Things are not quite right until you fluff those cushions, or you want to rearrange the chairs, or just adjust the lighting. Maybe you just know like to walk in a room. Maybe it's at home, maybe it's in a workplace, just to open a window, and everybody is relieved. But it wasn't up until the point where you opened the window that people realized that they needed relief. I've often worked with nurses and midwives, and this is something that comes up a lot, that they tend to be very sensitive to the subtle changes that can have massive effects in a ward, for example, like opening a window or refreshing the water jugs. Sensitive people tend to be more likely to be moved by the arts, music, nature, companionship with animals, seeing deep connections in relationships that maybe aren't so apparent to most. It's not a surprise that they are probably drawn to caring and healing professions and also creative professions and endeavors. From all the people that I've worked with, I certainly find that where sensitive people don't have a creative outlet, this is one of the main reasons that they will be struggling. They tend to have quite a twitchy nervous system, so prone to anxiety, prone to maybe low mood, prone to having a very intense inner critic, maybe experiencing imposter syndrome a lot, and then questioning the imposter syndrome, and so on. They can easily feel a bit overtasked, a bit grumpy if suddenly someone just comes and lands that extra task on their desk, because maybe they're not feeling quite seen with the amount they're doing. Sensitive people, after all, they are taking in and processing a lot of information all the time. And so when they're working deeply on something, they don't necessarily expect to have another thing landed on them to fix as well. At the same time, they're also the one fluffing the cushions, sorting the water jugs, and opening the windows, and worrying about the state of the world. So it's not a surprise that they can become, a bit overwhelmed in this sense. Tend to be conflict averse. They will hog that remote control and skip over potential violent scenes in a movie or a TV show. They tend to be daydreamers. They have a rich imagination, rich inner life. They tend to remember their dreams as well, and they tend to find meaning in them. They tend to make meaning in them, and they tend to enjoy talking about them, perhaps with others, and listening to other people's dreams and getting into the detail of what it might mean. What are the symbols? And one of the crucial things about sensitive people is that by and large, they really need alone time. But they may feel guilty about it because they're also hardwired to service everybody else's needs. As I said, refresh that water jug, open that window, and so on. They may also have more unusual experiences, which is the thing I've touched on with the psi stuff as well. So by and large, sensitive people tend towards what we might loosely call introversion. However, it's estimated that about 30% of sensitive people are actually really quite extroverted and they're sensation seeking at the same time. So it becomes complex, but these are the kind of, main ingredients here. So what do we know? Well, we know it's an innate, oops, too fast. We know that it's an innate trait. So it's thought that it's maybe got a genetic component. So if you are identifying yourself in this category, you might identify someone else and maybe one of your parents, if not both. It's thought that it has a certain evolutionary advantage. Research since the 1990s has suggested that it's about 25% of the population generally, globally. But interestingly, according to Aaron, the actually sensitive people make up probably over half the people seeking therapy and seeking some kind of, well-being intervention. So those statistics are quite startling. You think this is a healthy subset of the general population. It's quite a lot of people, but they are in a minority, but still a lot of people, but they make up so many people seeking support. So what is going on here? It's found in loads of other species. And I always like to reference the wolf because I think we get, again, a nice metaphor from the wolf. If we imagine that we have a pack of wolves, let's say there are 4 or 5 wolves in a pack. Sorry to any wolf experts if I'm getting like wolf psychology wrong, but the metaphor stands. The wolves come out of a forest clearing and they're hungry and they decide among them, right, we need to, get something to eat. They spot some prey and so let's just say 4 of the wolves go off for the hunt. One wolf stays back. And the wolf stays back on the forest's edge. Not because the wolf isn't hungry, not because the wolf is like too sensitive or, isn't tough enough to go in for the kill, but because if something goes wrong with that hunt, they're all going to go hungry. The wolf that stays back has the observation of the entire landscape ahead. They are there to notice the subtle, to notice the changes, to see what is coming over the horizon, whether it's a weather shift, a weather change, whether it's a new food source, another predator, competition, whatever it might be. They are there to see, to spot threats and opportunities, changes in cycles, things which are going to subvert the natural course so that they can inform the others. So this idea here is that there's a few that are kind of supporting the many. It's found neurologically that there are actual differences in terms of maybe brain structure. First, one example would be that it's found that there is more activity in the mirror neurons in a highly sensitive person than in someone who wouldn't score so highly on the sensitivity scales. And mirror neurons are thought to be, in part responsible for how we experience empathy. So how we see a look of pain in someone's face and we feel something in response. If more activity in those neurons makes sense, we would feel maybe more of that pain, or maybe we would notice it at a greater level of subtlety. Sensitive people process information very deeply. And they take in more as well, because they're taking in that subtlety, the nuance, the detail. So they're taking in more information and processing it very deeply. It's not like a disorder where the information, there's so much available, but it's not being efficiently processed and is sort of spilling out perhaps over the top. This is a processing style that is successful. It successfully processes all that information, but sometimes needs extra time to do it. So maybe if you think back to being at school, for example, maybe just needing a little bit more time to sit with ideas or to sit with your work. And there are many, reasons why schools could benefit from this information. But it's not because the person would be not understanding the material, it's because they're wanting to understand it at depth. It's like go deep or go home, try and explain a quadratic equation without the kind of theory. It's not really going to get absorbed that well. They want to know deeply how things work. They have a very high attention to social and emotional information. Again, this is perhaps about this role in nature, about looking after the collective, about being nature's wise people, the sort of natural shamans of the community, of seeing what's going on in the collective and what's changing, what's shifting, what's coming. It's experienced inwardly with this attention to nuance, attention to detail, but also with questioning where the person's sense of self is within that collective. And they can often, if you look at this little graphic over here, this is a little illustration from my book, which really just highlights this idea that many people, and I would say arguably sensitive people, they can be quite consumed in every day with picking up these little questions, like, what if I don't fit in? What if they don't like me? What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm too sensitive? What if I'm not tough enough? All of these things. And we can never really resolve them because we're not in a container that supports them. If this person is among the more highly sensitive and they are in the few, then they're in a container which is not going to help resolve these questions. And what I've found from working with people for many years now is that when we kind of put these questions down for a moment, what if I'm not good enough? What if I don't fit in? If we turn around and we look at maybe the big question that's behind us and we go existential, we go into the philosophy, the depth, we're asking questions like, what is my purpose? What is the meaning of life? Why am I here? And I've found in practice that a really curious thing happens, that when you pop these down, turn around and examine the bigger question that might be there, these questions resolve themselves. When we put ourselves into purpose, into that sense of what we contribute to society, using our sensitivity as a strength, working with that subtlety of perception, then these just don't seem to matter so much anymore. So that's the kind of inward experience again, and it leads us to the big questions. We tend to be really responsive to physical, environmental stimuli that others would just miss, like perhaps just sensing something's a bit different in a room, or sensing a drop in temperature that others don't notice until they're physically cold. It seems that other kind of sensory curiosities are likely to be more abundant among sensitive people, such as ASMR, if anyone's familiar with that. It's like you get hearing a low sound or a clicking sound and you get a tingling sensation in the body, or misophonia, which is where you can't quite stand the sound of like deep clacking, chewing sounds. Not that anyone enjoys those. Or it could be synesthesia, where you have a crossing of the senses. It might be visual snow. This is kind of anecdotal at the moment, but there's a sort of emerging, basis for this, that there's some potential relationship here. Sensitive people tend to be more responsive to psychological material that, again, others would likely miss. This is stuff that might be in their own kind of unconscious. They might just have this ability to just detect things that are just kind of there under the surface, if you like, of that sea, under the surface of that ocean surface, and bring it into awareness. They might be more aware as well of shifts in their own states of consciousness, such as, in between sleep and awake. Some people just quite enjoy staying in that state and being in that kind of imaginal realm, or being in that kind of that dream state where I know I'm waking up and I just want to go back and see what happens in the dream, or I want to go back and finish something in the dream, or then you take the dream into the waking world and so on, which of course ties in with meaning making and dreaming, and more likely to have these unusual experiences. And I've put some names along the bottom here for amazing researchers who are real experts in this area. So I would encourage you to check them out. Okay, and this is a point where I was going to offer just a little bit of sensory rest and a few minutes, perhaps, of a breakout room to discuss if this feels like it resonates with you, if so, in which ways, or perhaps.
Welcome back, Kirsty. You take it away, Kirsty.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks everybody for taking some time to chat about that as well. So let's take a look at the next section then. So let's look at some curious research findings. So you're probably noticing the cat theme. This is just, it's my life, basically. All my slides have a cat theme. Okay, so where it gets really curious, if it hasn't already piqued your curiosity, is in this very niche field of parapsychology. And I mentioned before that the term HSP was sort of coined in the 1990s, and it's kind of become a common parlance and relates quite specifically to that sensory processing sensitivity. But I just like to propose that we focus on the word sensitivity again, because there's maybe a lot more to this picture. And that's when we think, well, the term sensitivity has been used a lot for a long time. In fact, back to the 19th century, the precursor to parapsychology was a field called psychical research, which is still very much alive. And that was from scholars from the 19th century set up things like the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, which is still going today. I'm a member of that. But way back then, the people or subjects of interest to those researchers, those people who had maybe mediumistic capacities, or they seem to have some kind of psychic tendency, they seem to be able to affect things around them, they were often just known as the sensitives. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So just, throwing that one in there. But also in the 90s, sensitivity as an idea was being considered in the work around people who experienced what they then called UFOs, or encounters. Of course, we call them UEPs today, to be politically correct to our extraterrestrial neighbors. And it was found that there's a certain sensitivity might be linked to the prevalence of those experiences. There was some suggestion about a link between people who had allergies, for example, eczema, asthma, allergies, these kind of physical sensitivities might in some way be a partial explanation of these kinds of unusual activities. It's a very interesting idea, not one that necessarily has had a lot of follow-up really since then, but nonetheless, there was something very curious about that link to sensitivity. And that could work as well, linking into work around electromagnetic fields and how electromagnetic fields might be affecting the brain itself, in particular the temporal lobes. It's been found much more recently that high sensitivity, people with who regard themselves as HSP or score highly on the scales, they just tend to naturally report more unusual experiences than average. It seems to be that it's more normal, if you like, for highly sensitive people to report psychic or unusual type encounters or predictions, etc. The EMF is a particularly interesting one. There was a really interesting study with Watt and Masulo, where two groups of people were taken around a reputedly haunted building. I say reputedly haunted because I'm not talking about evidence here for the nature of ghosts or the ontology of a haunting. I don't think I could really speak to that. But what they did find, which is really super interesting, was that the two groups were categorized by the continuum of sensitivity. One group was highly sensitive and the other group was not. And they were sent around this building to see what they could notice, to see what they could experience room by room. And the upshot was that the people in the sensitive category identified certain rooms that had a feeling to them, that had a quality to them, that they may be identified as being unusual in some way. And those are the rooms with the haunted reputations. And what was found in those rooms was that I think it was a slightly higher electromagnetic field strength. So when those people, the sensitives, if you like, are maybe surveying a landscape, maybe in a building, maybe it's outdoors, whatever. When people are saying, "I feel something," or "there's something about this," or whatever language they use, they're talking from genuine experience. I think we can cut ourselves that slack as well, is to say we don't have to keep justifying everything. That we're not making it up. Similarly, Williams Carr and Grove looked at a phenomena called EVP. So that's electronic voice phenomena. And that's something that's quite a popular idea among ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. Again, I can't speak to the reality of whether EVP is a real thing or not. But what it is in practice is a researcher, an investigator will take like a device in a place where they think there might be activity. They will record their voice, leave a message like, if you are here, tell us your name. And then they will leave space on the recording and then play it back. And they would maybe find some kind of noise or something on there that wasn't expected and wasn't heard in the environment at the time. And some may interpret that to be some kind of voice, something embedded in that material. But what these researchers did was they kind of made their own EVP tracks. And they made two sets. So they made one set that genuinely had human voice in them, that they kind of degraded the voice so that it was like white noise. And in the other set, there was no human voice. And again, two groups of people, one who would score highly for sensitivity and the other who didn't. And the group who scored highly could tell the difference between the tracks that did and did not contain degraded human voice. So again, not speaking necessarily to anything paranormal, but it's saying like when people are saying, "I can hear this," or "I can sense this," or "I can feel this," they were not making it up. It's like, here's the evidence. Of course, if you are a sensitive person and you notice these things and you experience these things and you've doubted yourself all your life, this is great news because it's given us a little bit of permission here to maybe just have that bit more faith. Other kinds of research to do with like sensory restriction, where we take out the senses, such as in the Ganzfeld over here. That's me in what's called a Ganzfeld, where you have red light bathed over your face and you have white noise or pink noise playing, and it creates a kind of homogeneity, like a kind of like a, static sort of field, if you like, of sensory information. And it's thought that under those conditions, we might be more psi conducive because we're kind of blocking out all the distractions of sensory information around us. But similarly, float tanks has become one of interest. And I've just completed quite a large study of over 100 trials of people in flotation tanks, seeing what they experience. But this research team here, Johnson, Grimm, and Shelgren, they noted that people who would score highly in sensitivity tended to naturally just have these mystical experiences induced by sensory restriction techniques. So they were putting people in float tanks and then saying, what do people experience? And there seems to be a relationship between high sensitivity and your propensity to have a mystical or transcendental or an anomalous experience. So there's something really interested in this sensory sensitivity. And when we take away sensory information, that's what parapsychology is very interested in. It's saying, well, what else is there? When you take out, the sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and with the float, you're floating, so you get a sense of weightlessness and you have no sense of orientation of where your body is in the world. So it kind of heightens it again. And it's like, well, what's going on in here? Can we perceive this subtle information? So further research as well suggests that there may be a link to what's called the aesthetic dimension of the trait. And that seems to be a propensity for sensitive people to be attracted to things which are beautiful, things which are harmonious in some way. So they tend to be moved by scenes of nature. They tend to be moved by really great art. They tend to just know the difference between what is and what isn't a really beautiful, piece of prose or poetry. They can maybe notice the subtle detail around, architecture and maybe imperfections of proportions and things like this. There's just some kind of subtlety going on there. And this parapsychological literature is suggesting that ability to perform well in tasks, perhaps, or the capacity to just experience these things spontaneously may be linked to that dimension. There's something called the recipe for success, which has been long established in parapsychology, coined by Charles Honorton. And it certainly suggests that there are certain traits or characteristics for people who will perform well under lab conditions in a psychic task. And it states things like openness to experience, makes sense. Creativity is a big one. Neuroticism, although it's the inverse of that, ability to be calm rather than, be spiraling. And extroversion, perhaps that's something around the ability to communicate or the desire to communicate your experience. But having prior side experience, having a practice of some kind of discipline and so on, all seem to make up what might be thought of as the recipe for success. And for me, I think that we're really looking at this sensitive population where you've got people who are drawn to spiritual matters, for example, they're drawn to practices, they're drawn to creativity, they're drawn to all of these things. They're probably quite introspective. They've maybe done a lot of self-work around anxiety and self-awareness, all of these things. What we've potentially got here, if you have sensitive people and you kind of train them to be the best version of themselves, the happiest version of them, we've potentially got, the psi sensitives. So there's also ongoing research that kind of looks into this intersection of sensitivity and what it might mean. So traits, that's your characteristics, states of consciousness, contents of things like dreams, and thin spaces, that sense of maybe going into churches and feeling there's a qualitative difference within that space than there is maybe without it, and so on. Different points of land, maybe sites of standing stones, for example, some people seem to naturally be drawn to them, seem to feel things when they're there. So there's these subscales of sensory processing sensitivity that we can, again, we've been quite general, don't wish to completely generalize, but everyone, but this is the really interesting intersection. So first one makes sense, ease of excitation, like we're kind of maybe more easily like overstimulated, overwhelmed by everything that's going on. And, like if you're deeply concentrating, deeply absorbed in a book, and then a carrier jet flies overhead that really startles you, it's that kind of ease of excitation. Low sensory threshold is that it doesn't take a lot of information for you to notice it's there. Whereas most people might be kind of blindly going about their business and not notice something which is burning in the corner kind of thing. Dramatic, idea, but there we are. So it's the noticing of detail that maybe other people would miss, that doesn't take much for it to come into your awareness. And that can also be your own inner contents as well, not necessarily just what's going on around you. And then this curious thing, the aesthetic sensitivity, this being affected by harmony, beauty. And you could think that these all might support psi experiences, this experience of being perhaps more aware of the subtle, perhaps more in tune with the liminality of nature where things are unfixed. So you can see how it might support all three of these. Yeah. So what I suspect from all of this is that in sensitive people, we have potentially this real recipe for success, for this strength, this almost spiritual or shamanic strength, this wise folk archetype strength that we perhaps embody, is that we are very embodied, that we really notice what goes on in our body. We have really strong gut feelings. The difficulty is that when we also experience things like anxiety or self-doubt, we might also feel that in the gut as much as we might feel an intuition. So learning to tease these things apart is kind of part of the process, part of the work. We tend to be intuitive thinking in our style of thinking, So yes, we can be rational and we can be logical, but we actually really appreciate the intuitive. There's something at depth that going on there. There's something that's not obvious on the surface as it is with rational, logical thinking. An intuitive way of thinking is one that kind of comes almost like from the body up, if you like. Like you have the insight, but you don't know how it got there. It's a very, very fast, natural processing of loads of information and taking on board prior experience and using a kind of internal heuristic to arrive at a likely probability that maybe signals take a different route today. Or, yes, this is a good choice for you. And you just kind of feel it in the body. And sensitive people seem to maybe make more decisions based on that. The idea of liminality is really powerful. So something which is liminal is in a threshold. So I've mentioned quite a lot of this before, but I'm going to apply this word now. So liminality really means that things are in an unfixed state of being. So in between states of consciousness, for example, when you're kind of asleep but kind of awake. It could be that sense of self where you're very immersed in the emotions of others and noticing how that's making you feel. So you're kind of, two in one at the same time, sort of fluid sense of self. Maybe we're sliding around those states of consciousness, maybe we get in and out of daydreaming, for example. Maybe flow states when we're allowing ourselves to be in maybe our creative or our healing tasks, those things that really speak to us, maybe in an art gallery, even begin in a flow state. If it's genetic and if there's this, inherited kind of component to sensitivity, it might just make sense that more people in our immediate family have also had psi experiences. So when you think, okay, I'm going to say, I wouldn't say to many people, oh, I had this dream and it came true. But you might say it to someone in your family because you've already heard that your Auntie Jean used to have psychic dreams, or that Uncle Bob always knew when a stranger would come round, this kind of thing. So it's kind of almost a little bit maybe more normalized in those families. So it becomes a bit more familiar. Again, sensitive people tend to be really attracted to depth. They're attracted to the deep meaning and meaning making. So symbolism, metaphor, myth, for example, getting really into the detail of like shared stories, ancestry, maybe using things like oracle decks, to explore the imagery. Yeah. So also transpersonal or spiritual interests, as I mentioned already, that might support these kinds of experiences. You're kind of naturally got an inclination towards them because perhaps pop culture stuff just doesn't cut it for you. It doesn't quite go deep enough for you to feel satisfied. Maybe you want that more philosophical edge. You want that depth edge, or you want to know about the science of the cosmos. But then you end up down not just a rabbit hole, but down a black hole trying to understand the deeper meaning of it all. Never mind maybe the maths. And there's an appreciation of when funny things happen, an appreciation of things like synchronicity, of that meaningful coincidence when it crops up, because perhaps that relates back to embodiment. There's a felt sense of it being important in some way. And maybe not afraid to be open about this subject. When your needs are being met, taking us back to being an orchid, when your needs are being met, we can really freely exchange and discuss and explore all of this material. And in doing so, perhaps foster more of it for ourselves. But of course, I would say it's nothing new. None of this is new. All the mystery schools have kind of talked about this since forever. They sort of said to us, you want to get to know God and the universe, become more sensitive, dissolve that sense of self, become more fluid in your boundaries. Spend time in nature. Observe the subtle rhythms of the world around you. Take yourself off into sensory restriction or sensory deprivation. Have quiet time, have contemplative time in a dark room, in a cave, wherever, the particular culture might send you. And so I kind of feel like the parapsychology and consciousness research is kind of becoming a living body of proof for what the mystics have always told us. And what they've been telling us is that sensitivity is our greatest strength. They've been saying you will want to, you want to go beyond, you want to understand the connections at depth, you want to, reach the heavens. Well, it's about this limit, it's about this liminal boundary here, about being able to traverse the limit. And by being a naturally fluid person whose identity is entangled with the identity of those around them, because they're in this flux of knowing how everyone else might think and feel and wanting to attend to that at the same time and serving that collective. And perhaps it might just go that bit further. And so the proposition that I would put here, and these are kind of in a way a slightly random collection of symbols because I try to visualize something which is very hard to visualize. At the top, we have the brain, and we have like the 5 regular senses, as you can see. And up here in this regular world, we call it the material world for the sake of argument, this is kind of our immediate reality. This is kind of what we're experiencing on the surface, of reality. So our attention is drawn towards aesthetic qualities. Our attention is drawn towards things that are beautiful and harmonious. And it tends to ignite this emotion in us, if you remember that third part of that third subscale. So we feel in awe, we feel emotionally moved, we feel we want more, we feel like this deeper sense of connection. And perhaps, that's why we're drawn to art, where's it going? To art, to, literature, to philosophy, to music. Perhaps we're really moved by like the scent of something, it's always a bit of a paradox where you have the scent of something really subtle, like an apple on a tree, and that scent of the apple is almost like telling you something about the health of the apple, and it's telling you something about the health of the tree, and it's telling you something about the health of the roots of the tree, and so on and so on, in a really subtle way. But then you walk around a corner and pass a bin, and game over, and so it's like paradoxical way of being. It might be that you're really attuned, or you like to witness the turning of the seasons, the cycles. As one changes from the other in that liminal space, going from, as we're now autumn into winter, and noticing the subtlety rather than things being in distinct stages. You're noticing the nuance and the gradation of it. And maybe about how people communicate, whether it's through prose, poetry, numbers, drawings. There's something about certain nuanced or certain celebrated works that maybe really appeal, and maybe that's why they're celebrated. And so on and so on. Maybe we cry at a sunset, that kind of thing. But maybe it's signaling something more. So for example, maybe up here, we're kind of sensing into what we've created symbols for. We've created symbols for a reason, to help us understand what's going on up here. So for example, a great work of art might actually be representing not just immense skill, but it might be representing a mathematical formula. It might be representing, sacred geometry. It might be representing something which is more universal, something at a more subtle level, at a deeper level than is immediately observable. So I've just used a bit sort of random symbols here really for that, but to try and get at that. So maybe this underlying symbolic world that's kind of pressing up into our awareness is kind of showing us a universal map of meaning. So it's up there into the material awareness, represented through myth, architecture, music, and so on. And it's witnessed through nature and humanity's self-expression. And maybe that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to this deeper shared unification of meaning. And maybe the reason we create those symbols, and again, I'm aware of the irony of having more symbols to talk about non-symbols. Maybe we create these symbols because we're trying to talk about something that's even more nuanced, that's even more subtle. We're trying to get back to source. We're trying to get back to that ocean. We're the starfish trying to get home. And we're saying, I'm feeling the probabilities here. I'm feeling the cause and effects. I'm feeling vibration. I'm feeling like the shared rhythm between nations. I'm feeling all of these things. And perhaps these are pushing up, this information, this level of subtlety of information all around us is pushing up through our dreams, in our artwork, in our literature, etc., through symbols and into this kind of world of manifestation. And where we might have, for example, a natural cycle that's unfolding, we might find that, if there's something that's going to be disrupted in that cycle, then, sorry, where's my cursor gone? There it is. Something is going to be disrupted in that cycle. Perhaps it's a commuter cycle, for example, and the same train goes every day at the same time, week after week, day after day, for years and years and years. And then something happens in a dream and it tells you not to get on the train that day. And there are many anecdotal, well-charted cases of this happening. Maybe it's because there's something about the probabilities, and that maybe we're sensing that there's going to be a disruption. And just as in the same way that if we're prone to anxiety, if we're prone to sort of spotting the threats and also spotting the opportunities, it doesn't have to be limited to what's already apparent in our environment. It could be that when a probability is being shown or is being thrown out as being a deviation from expectation, perhaps our attention, some part of us, is a laser focus on that to say, what is that? What is that deviation? What is that that's coming over the horizon in time? What is that that's coming over the landscape of time? What is that? And we pay attention to that. And we have a funny feeling about it. And that funny feeling is enough to signal a statistical edge for safety. And what if, even beyond that, it is that unmanifest place, that place of unknowable, ineffable mystery? That's what we're trying to get to. What if? And so, as my good friend Carl Jung, mention him a lot, I feel like I know him. Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. And perhaps that's what sensitive people are really able to do with that liminality, what we might call transliminality in their being, is to be able to sense that subtlety and allow it to come up into awareness, beyond that threshold of awareness, and be excited by it, i.e. by noticing it. And that's when maybe at that point, our senses are not just the five senses anymore. This is maybe where the real subtle strength really lies. And so I really think there's a lot going on here about liminal states of consciousness, this fluid sense of self, where we are receptive, open, because there's we're not as fixed perhaps as most people. We don't have the same thicker boundaries as most people, that we have that lower sensory threshold and the capacity to sense deep structures and therefore likely probable events which may be unfolding, which makes sense if we then have a precognitive dream. It makes sense if we just have spidey senses about something. It makes sense if we are really, in tune with reading tarot, for example. And so I kind of feel like this builds to something that I call sensitive magic, because I do believe this is our natural state of being as sensitive people. We are the natural wise folk of the community. And it's really time to recognize that as a strength, as maybe the ultimate strength. It might just give all of us, as everybody, no matter where they are on the continuum of sensitivity, the survival edge and the change in society that we need to make more empathic decisions, to make more fluid choices that might affect and support the masses rather than the few. And this little infograph here, it really just looks at tying it all together, that awareness of the subtle, enhanced use of primary processes such as intuition, perceiving beyond, and the capacity to know the feelings and states of others. And in this mix, I really do think that we are potentially the natural leaders. We just have to step into that strength. And so some ideas here for leveraging that magic. We can cultivate the awareness. We can cultivate by noticing our own quirks and any anomalies that we might experience, and asking our family members and close friends if they experience them. Because the more we can talk about all of this, the more we normalize it. The more we normalize it, the more we experience it. The more we experience it, the more we trust it, and so on. Get down with the dream diary. Start to trust your intuition. If you need help telling the difference between intuition and, say, an anxiety feeling, then that's the sort of thing I can really help you with. Really appreciating structures and patterns. So by doing so, that means getting into the world of symbology, really studying signs, symbols, metaphor, and myth, and really allowing yourself spiritual and creative practices as kind of fundamental to your well-being, but also to foster that strength of sensitive magic. And not affording yourself time for self-care, for creativity, for spirituality, You know, you can take it on the chin here that it's not just you're doing yourself a disservice, but perhaps the whole collective. So we owe it to all of us to really celebrate who we are and nurture it as well. And that helps us to develop faith, faith in ourselves, faith in each other, and faith in the future of this world. And perhaps as well, if you come on the journey, to kind of uncover your sort of personal style and how you might cultivate that. And so I'm just cautious of the time. So
maybe we've got time. Maybe people might like to ask a question. Have you got some?
yeah. So I've got a slide here, and then there's a big
Yeah.
breakout or questions. It's all good. This is another illustration from the book. It's just to say, you know, again, you might notice around you that there are pathways which are already mapped out, but maybe they don't quite feel right. Maybe they don't quite sense, you know, in any way like something you want to follow. You know, perhaps it's time in that case to forge your own path and to follow that sensitivity, to follow that curiosity, to follow where your senses are leading you. And then you might find that you're just forged a brand new pathway that other people have been waiting for or happen to just need. And I do often think that where we've got world leaders, etc., who seem to force their way to the front in order to be the leader, they're not really forging new pathways. You know, they've sent other people ahead of them to do the hard work, to twist their ankles on the journey. So I do think that the real leaders in the world, the ones who can really make the biggest difference, are the ones who are reluctant, the ones who feel, oh, not me. That's, oh no, you know, I'm feeling quite cautious, or, oh, I don't know about that. Who's going to listen to me? Inner critic is coming in. I would ask you just to think, what if all of that is signaling to you that that's exactly why you should be leading. That's exactly why you should be leading, in spite of the anxiety. You know, that's what the world needs now, is to be re-enchanted through our natural magic. And that's it for now. So there's another either breakout opportunity or
I think, well, let's just see if we have some questions. I know that when I heard this, do you want to take down the screen and we can,
yep,
and then we can do a view of people,
for the button. Oh,
gallery. I do know that when I heard this information for the first time, I was surprised to find that I was sensitive. Especially, and I realize, you know, in your terminology, that my passion and my interest in feng shui is I'm very sensitive to environments. And I think anybody who is in that area, that's one way of using a sensitivity. You know, you can't just put me in a restaurant and see me at any table. That's I have to sit in the right table where the energy's right. So let's just see whether anybody wants to ask a question on behalf of themselves. If you've seen something here that resonates with you, that you feel I was sensitive and you are, or somebody in your family. Debbie's saying that you mentioned tests.
yes, that's right. I'm going to put it in the chat right now. Here we go. That's Elaine Aron's website. So check out that. And that's specifically for what we call sensory processing sensitivity. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, all these things is definitely not a weakness. It's just if you understand there's a lot coming in and you're processing it all.
Absolutely.
And that's a good thing, and manage it, just like I've had my 2 days in the Lake District by myself. In nature. Diane got a question. Should we bring you on, Diane? Okay, ask to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. This has been really brilliant. It's not so much a question, it's more a comment, and it is that because you're talking about leaders, and I've spent ages the last few years thinking, if you want to be a leader, why aren't you leading us into something sensible? So if there are loads, but however, I would also add that I've been seeing for a while, a couple of years, that there's a movement going on. Things are changing, life is changing. And if a few of the sensitives or the wise ones or whoever would stand up and, you know, I don't know, I haven't got the answers. It's just a comment that I agree with everything you're saying. There's lots of sensitive people. Thank goodness the human race is finally looking at the fact that we are all able to be more sensitive to each other and
Exactly.
hopefully make conscious decisions about how to run the world.
That's it. Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. And it does look like, I mean, again, we don't know for sure. You gotta wait for the science. It does look like sensitivity might be increasing. And perhaps this is one of nature's ways of rectifying some problems.
Definitely. There's a movement going on, definitely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes sensitivity, can be brought about through trauma and hardship and things. So it can almost ignite what might look like mental health problems. But then maybe with that, there's something else. There's a bit of gold in there that's getting overlooked.
I was going to say, because that's the whole point. If we could have more education that leads us into appreciating, rather than we've got a problem, we've got an extra sensitivity that we can use as a gift and help people learn how to live with that gift, first of all, and secondly, how to use it. It would be really helpful, wouldn't it?
Thank you. That's my mission. Yes, I'm gathering sensitives, so.
Great.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank
It's
you.
great. And Norma's just commenting here about her mum says I'm too sensitive. It's lovely, isn't it? Too sensitive. Accusation. So
Yeah.
yes, to have no faith in oneself, because sensitivity has not necessarily, it has been seen as something being weak. You're just too sensitive, get with the program. And
Oh, no.
it's what you're sharing here is the reversal of that we actually need it, and I love the nuance of it as well.
Yeah, there's a comment there from Jack about how can I channel my sensitivity to work for me? I feel my empathy can restrict me at times. My guess is this isn't uncommon. Absolutely. It's learning. That's the thing. It's a paradox. If we've got a moment, I'll just share something with you. I skipped over these earlier just due to time, but if you can see, can you see this? Yeah. Okay. So if you think of it as a paradox, yeah. So on the one hand, you might have a double-edged sword, chicken and egg, two sides of the same coin. Yeah. So that's why I use a lot of metaphor, because otherwise it's a lot, right? So metaphor. So with sensory processing sensitivity, if we think about the challenges, it's like with the empathy, it's a bit like, are you that person that gets, you goes to a party and you think, oh, it's going to be fine. It's going to be lovely. I like people. I'm sociable. But you end up in a corner with someone who wants to give you their life story and trauma and everything. And then they don't stop. And by the end of it, they've got your number so they can continue to tell you about it. And it's all a lot, right? And it's difficult to make decisions for yourself and to even know where your feelings kind of sort of end, if you like, and someone else's might begin, and what's the interplay of those. So it's like self-awareness training, and it's all about boundaries, and so sensitive people have very thin boundaries, whereas other people tend to have thicker boundary. And again, that's a continuum where some people have really thick boundaries and they're like, I am me in the world and everything else is like my resources. That's great. We need those people for sure. And then in the middle, people a bit more like a membrane, and then on the other side of it, where the sensitivity lies, high sensitivity, is that boundary is almost non-existent. It's like really thin, so we're really fluid in our identity, and how we view ourselves is largely wrapped up in how we think other people view us, and it leads to things like people pleasing. It leads to social anxiety. It leads to trying so hard that you burn out. It leads to not asking for your needs to be met in case you're seen as a problem, and so on and so on. You're constantly checking in with the community, with the majority, to check that you're okay and they're okay with you and that you belong. But the irony is, because you're a bit different, you feel different and you feel othered. So you end up as the weirdos at the end of the village. But actually, when you're out there doing your laundry and it's a beautiful day and your laundry's still wet, but you take it in, people think they're a bit strange. But actually, 2 minutes later, they'll all be rushing out to take the laundry in because you just had this sense that the weather would change. That kind of thing, metaphor again. And it's an interplay, that empathy. So it's about learning that. So I've just whizzed through this just to contextualize, because this might be helpful for quite a few. If you can understand that there's all these challenges, we say, I don't call them symptoms because that puts us in a medical model and pathologizes this, and it's not pathology. Yeah, this is a healthy trait, but it comes with this. But what's the thing on the other side? Well, all of this stuff that I've been talking about, the strength, yeah, all of these things. And so maybe there's something in the middle that means it's both and. If you shut this one down, you're going to shut this down. And that's why I think so many sensitive people are disenfranchised in our modern world, because sensitivity has not been placed as a strength. It's been seen as a weakness. We heard that message all our lives. Yeah, you got to toughen up. You know, you're too sensitive. What are you crying for? And things like that, you know, and it's like, just completely rubbishes us at our core. And at best, we might get some mental health support or maybe physical support for biological conditions. But this is the thing that's going on in the middle. So that low sensory threshold, it doesn't take much for us to be stimulated, i.e. it doesn't take much for us to notice stuff. That we have these thin fluid boundaries about who we are, fluid sense of self, that we're transliminal, we're sliding around states of consciousness, if you like. Information is more available to us. We process actually quite rapidly, but sometimes there's so much information that we need time out to process it, because we have to process it deeply. And we notice the detail, and we're making meaning all the time, which is why we can be very creative, because at that depth level, when you're making meaning, you're making more neural connections, more pathways. So it's going to foster innovation. It's going to foster novelty and new ideas and insight that maybe just doesn't happen elsewhere. And so it is paradoxical. And there's something about embracing the difficulty. Oh, where's it going? So that we can accept the strengths. So, sorry, this thing moves around a lot. So a tendency to experience the self-doubt, but actually that's also the tendency to have greater self-awareness. Tendency for overwhelm is also the tendency for acuity. Tendency for that empathy, Jack, that you talked about, is also the tendency for sensing what's needed in the collective. You know, what's missing, what's changing, where the trigger points might be. Boundary thinness, people train their whole lives to experience no self. You know, in the meditation world, billions of dollars every year, you know, people trying to reach this kind of state of no self. And here we are traversing it all the time. Feeling different or othered, or being weird or a weirdo. But actually, we're in kind of a cool club. And maybe feeling misunderstood. That's because we're undermined in a relatively insensitive culture. You know, so if you can imagine that you're trying to express your empathy, your desire to care for others, to help fix the world, under maybe like NHS conditions, that's maybe in many respects not a great container to support your needs. And yet, there we are. So I think that so many sensitive people are just quietly burning out because this paradox is not being observed. It's kind of like, if you speak up, oh, you have a problem, let's help you with that. Let's help you with it by shutting it down.
You've got a lot of great information on these slides, and that's what we're going to send people, aren't we? Because they can review that.
That's it. So basically, you resolve the challenges when you start leveraging the advantages. Stop focusing on what's wrong, because there's nothing wrong. Focus on these, and this will sort itself out. And we do this with children. It's amazing what happens. But the advantages and the challenges are a blur when they're on top of each other. Yeah, they're a complete blur. How do you tell them apart? How do you tell anxiety from intuition when you feel them both in the gut? You know, you have to train. You have to train yourself. Learn to trust yourself. Yeah, there we go.
And just reaffirming what you said about what if. That's why it's proud that you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think Judy's going to put the website link in here. We'll send the website link to your website and to your if crowd. If anybody's interested in furthering that, they can come and find you there. It's interesting when you see this in action that works. It's like a leader or a speaker or a focalizer of a group has an agenda. There's a program that says, I'm feeling that there's a need for this. It's like sensing what the group need, what the audience needs, and being willing to let go of the program and say, I don't know what we need, but let's feel into the space. I mean, I think that's a great modern skill of being willing to say, I'm feeling we need to change something and do that. So
that's it. And the if crowd's just taken a new life as well after around the sense retreat. I got so much information from what people really wanted next that we're going to turn it into a co-creative space. So rather than just me making like 90% of the material, it's going to be far more co-creative. And the structure on there is different as well. So if you want to join it, just put your fill out the email list thing or email me, and we'll get you a login for it. Yeah.
It's growing in this way and gradually getting more and more confident in this sensitive area. Kirsty, thank you so much. I'm gonna that's fantastic, and it's great. You have a lot of information on the slides, really helpful for people, and I know they want them.